Okay, we're going to get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Board of Education meeting. The board has already met in executive session, and we saluted the flag in there. So we're going to start by taking the roll call.
Mr. Byrne?
Here.
Ms. Schaefer?
Here.
Mrs. Gray?
Here.
Mr. Salmon?
Here.
Mrs. White?
Here.
Mrs. Richmond?
Yeah, here.
Mrs. Korn?
Here.
Mrs. Wooldridge?
Here.
Mr. Markarian?
Here.
Mr. Syed?
Here.
Mrs. McCune?
Here.
Madam President?
Thank you. I'd like to draw your attention to the statement of public notice in your bulletin, in your agenda. This is a regular meeting. The Board of Education has been advertised according to the law. We welcome public input twice during the meeting. The first time is earlier in the meeting. We welcome public comment on agenda items. And later in the meeting, we welcome public comment on anything that you would like to speak about or ask us about. If you do come up for public comment, please tell us your name and address, and then sign in on the clipboard. You can sign in after you speak. You can read through this whole public notice. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the meeting is being recorded, so I just wanted to make you aware of that. Okay, we're up to our student representative, Maddie, who we've seen already, some of us today, because we met with the Ridge Student Government this morning with the Advocacy Committee.
Yeah, we just wanted to say on behalf of the student government, thank you to all the members that came out and spoke to us today for took an hour and a half out of your day to basically hear us complain, honestly. But I had a few comments that some kids felt like they didn't get a chance to say, just like topics that didn't get touched on. Some sophomores and anyone that's been through chem is kind of worried about the chem curriculum and wondering if we can sort of revisit that and the way it's being taught in our school. Sports games and practices occurring over spring break, if there's any way that could not happen. I don't know, just open up the discussion about that. Some clocks are a few minutes behind in the school. I don't know. I was just told that. And yeah, and I just wanted to let you guys know if there's any topics like the academic integrity that you guys would like me to tell the student government to sort of think about and talk to their peers about, and then we can bring it up to you guys the next time we meet or at a Board of Ed meeting. Just let me know any of those topics. And lastly, some score reports for you. Boys lacrosse is 13-1. Girls lacrosse is 11-3. Baseball is 12-6. Softball is 8-5. And it's the first day of a 2-week-long AP week, and we're getting ready for graduation.
Hey, thank you. I can respond to a couple of the things you said. I'm glad we got really good input from, and I'm sure when we report out from the Advocacy Committee, we'll get a lot of details about what we talked about. I think definitely any ideas or brainstorming that the students have about academic integrity and ways to have that conversation that you think students would be receptive to, ways to change that kind of culture and stuff would be great. Let me think what else. The clocks, we've heard weird things about the William Manning clocks too, so that seems to be something that should be able to be addressed. The conversation about, what was the other one I was going to say before that? Well, chemistry has been under discussion at the different curriculum committee meetings, and I know there's been modifications made, and that's been kind of something that is being looked at.
Okay, I'll tell you.
What was the other thing you said? There was another one I wanted. Over break, yeah. Because our district is not on the same calendar as every district in the county, it makes it really difficult. There was a movement long time ago, 10 years ago, for a while there was a county superintendent that wanted to make everyone go on the same calendar, and then that would have simplified it because then all the schools would have had the same break. The problem is everyone's on different breaks and they schedule games during other people's breaks, so that's very tricky. So that's the reason why it's not so simple. Does anyone else that was there this morning want to chime in about anything else we want to hear about? I thought you guys were great. They had a lot of good feedback this morning from the students. Oh yeah, the ideas about the media center. If there's more feedback from the students,
okay.
that would be good.
Yeah, I'll tell them that. Okay.
Oh yeah, one thing that Karen asked me after the meeting, did you bring up, and I said we got so busy and then we ran out of time. We had a few conversations about communication in general, in the district, how we all communicate. And so we were wondering, we struggle to get messages out to the community. You know what I mean? People get so many emails and so much stuff. And we're trying to figure out the best ways to push stuff out. And we were wondering with the students what ideas you guys have. I know the student government pushes out information and brings information back from the student body. If you guys have any ideas of, in the future, how the student government or other entities at Ridge could help get information out to students so that you guys know what's going
So it would be coming from you
on.
guys to the students?
Or just from,
Just
or
the
stuff that's
board in
going on in the school.
Okay.
Right, and how do students find out what's going on?
Okay.
I mean, I know often it's via their friends, but I mean, official communication about stuff that's going on.
Okay.
Sure, can I just add one
Yeah, go
thing?
ahead.
Additionally, I think we'd love to know what the students think about the best way to reach them with information that might be pertinent to them would be.
Thank you. Okay, at this point, we're at the public hearing on the 2019-20 budget. So the board is going to go down below for that. We have the packet here, so bring that down with you. There we go.
Good evening and welcome to the annual public hearing on the budget. This is the 2019-2020 proposed Berners Township School budget. I'm the business administrator, Rod McLaughlin, and I'll be presenting this evening with our superintendent, Mr. Markarian. And with that, I'll begin. So, for those of you who were at our preliminary hearing last month, well, actually it was a little over a month ago, we did it in March, the end of March. Some of these numbers will be familiar to you since we have not made any changes to the budget since the process entails a preliminary budget approval submission to the County Superintendent of Schools for his review and approval as the state's representative for the public hearing. He approves the content, format, and does a rather extensive review of what we propose. So this first slide is a macro summary just comparing the final budget that was submitted for approval last year, meaning the operating year that we're in right now, but over a year ago. And throughout, I want to give the one caveat that the numbers that you see, the comparative numbers, are budget to budget. So while during the course of the year, and even tonight you'll hear me allude to some changes that have occurred during the course of this year to what our adopted budget was, for the sake of comparing an apple to an apple, we compare what the budget was as it was struck and approved by the Board of Education in May of 2018 with what we are proposing now in May of 2019. The general operating expenses are, as you will see in a few minutes, for those of you who have never gone through this hearing before, are the day-to-day operating expenses of the district and entail virtually everything that we do, from instruction in the classroom to the payment of the electricity for the lights that are on in the PAC, and the maintenance and around the district and transportation, nursing services, it's all in there. Capital expenses are just what they sound like. They are large capital outlays for varying types of capital projects and any type of procurement of an asset that has a useful life of more than a year and a dollar value of more than $2,000. I didn't make that definition up. the state of New Jersey utilizes GAAP for public school districts, and that's a GAAP definition, and so therefore we account for those types of purchases there. As I get into the presentation tonight, you'll see that I talk about some of those purchases that were added into this year's budget. So overall, the net increase in the budget for the general fund, we are looking at a $1.5 million increase. Federal grant expenses, we anticipate going up by $329,000. When I talk about revenues in a minute, I'll explain why that is the case. It's really kind of an administrative anomaly, for want of a better way of describing it, and I'll talk about it when I get to revenues in a minute. Debt expenses are relatively flat, and that's the debt, the principal and the interest that we pay on the outstanding serial debt of the Board of Education and the public school district for bonds that were issued over various periods, but the last time I think was in around the mid-2000s, early 2000s. All in, the total budget is about $1.8 million more year over year, including all of those funding sources. So, as I indicated before, the general fund is up $1.5 million. The driver there really is salaries. So we're looking at contractual increases, ESY, or extended school year increases. Those are the costs to provide extended school year for our special needs students. We have seen a traditional increase in that year over year for the last 4 or 5 years. That has to do with the not so much as when we talk about it a little bit later in the budget, an increase necessarily in the number of students with special needs as an increase in the kind of need and the extensiveness of the needs of some of those students. In addition to that, substitute costs are up as well. As part of our budget, and traditionally we've talked about budgeted fund balance, and in an ensuing slide, I'm going to talk about, the fact that while for the last 3 years we've seen an increase in state aid, we had for many years seen a decrease in state aid, which when you total it up for the years where we were not funded at the state's statutorily prescribed levels, we're still about $18 million behind. And what that begat, so to speak, was the need to generate some balance from our own operations year over year through efficiencies as we go through the year to balance our budget in ensuing years. So what you see here is a number that appears in the fiscal year 17-18 audit. That means the period that ended June 30th of 2018. We generated a balance that we reserved specifically for the budget for 1920. Capital projects, we always like to talk up front a little bit about that, and we'll get into it a little bit more as we go forward, but let me start at the bottom in particular and talk about the projects themselves. So we have the final phase of the HVAC projects that we began, I think, 5 years ago now, because we've done Cedar Hill, we've upgraded the remainder of this building in that first year. We did Liberty Corner, we've also done Oak Street. Last year we did phase 1, which is the first half of the William Annan School, and this year we propose to do the instructional spaces in the 300 and 400 wing. These were replacements of the Univent systems and an upgrade of the building management software, meaning the network software that we use to remotely monitor and control those systems throughout the building. And so one of the things we did with that project when we started it 5 years ago was to go to an open architecture type of software, so that one, we would have greater ability to get, as these systems needed, multiple service providers, because in the past the district had a number of different systems that were very proprietary with only one potential service provider for repair. We found that to be ineffective from a number of perspectives and not necessarily cost effective as well. In addition to that, we did upgrade and put air conditioning in these spaces because we felt that that was something that would improve the quality of the instructional experience for our students in general sitting in classrooms. So this is the fifth and final year of that. That was a project that was one of 10 because they're split really into replacement of the old heating and ventilation systems and an upgrade. So there are 2 grants that we got in each case for each of those buildings from the School Developmental Authority. And you can see that reflected up at the top there as that share of part of that project. In addition, we had to have matching funds, and so that's the capital reserve withdrawal that we have. And the final piece of that project over at the high school, which was not an SDA project, but was always on the district's 5-year capital plan, which every year we talk about in August and we update, was the repair of the curtain wall, which is that's on the 400 wing. It's the outside wall. It's think of it as kind of a sheet metal composite type of wall, which is why it's called a curtain wall as opposed to a brick wall. And that wall has a number of dings and holes in it over the years because it's right along there's a lot of grass in the back and there's a rise there because it also raises up to where there are gas pipelines passing through. And so when they go through with lawnmowers, I don't know how many people are still mowing their own lawn, but I still do, and you hit a stone, it goes flying, and that's what's happened. So we're going to repair that as part of this project. On the bid that came in last December, it was about $100,000 worth of work. So relative to the size of the project, it's not that much, but I did want to mention that we are doing that. The other project that we're doing this summer is the first phase of what will probably be a multi-year project as we find the money to do it, to replace door hardware throughout the district. The first phase involves those doors that are fire-rated doors that we want to be able to lock down rather simply and efficiently without having to use magnetic strips on the doors, because the fire marshals would prefer that we use this approach to that. The other doors throughout the district don't have that fire issue necessarily, but we'd like to get uniformity with the hardware. And so this was something that we bid out. We did award this several months ago. It's a $200,000 project. And in terms of the operating budget, which I showed you in the first couple of slides, which is a $1.5 million operating increase for general fund, 200,000 of that of this project is in that amount, in that budget that's there, okay? So major factors in the budget. As I alluded to a few minutes ago, there was an increase in state aid. Again, this year it was $470,000. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more when I get to the revenue comparison slides in a minute. Current programs and services that we have right now are sustained. The budget continues to address our long-term capital needs, as I just mentioned. We have a number of significant projects that we're undertaking beginning this spring. In fact, this month they actually began the demo room, the demo and the build of the mock-up room at William Annan. So when we do these HVAC projects in the month of August, month of May, we always choose one room in whatever building we're going to be in. We demo that one room after coordinating with the building administration that they can give it up this early in the year. And we put in a mocked up installation of what we're going to do in the rest of the building. We've found that expedites and also identifies any potential problems that we may have with the design, both mechanically or architecturally, for that particular building or that particular project. It allows us to kind of get on top of that before we get into the full-blown piece in the end of June. The budget also provides for a wide range of equipment and small capital project requests, including new playground equipment at Mount Prospect, stage lighting at Cedar Hill School. The Ridge High School varsity baseball and soccer fields will get new netting systems, fencing replacement at Liberty Corner School, new exhaust fans for the William Annan Middle School locker rooms, ceiling fans for the William N. and school cafeteria, and enhanced Ridge High School main entrance lighting in that main area right out front under the clock, basically, when you walk in there. Enrollment in a variety of programs and staff turnover are going to determine considerations for additional staff. When we get to the end of this presentation tonight, Mr. Markarian is going to talk about that a little bit more. So what you have here is a 6-year budget revenue snapshot. I won't go back 6 years. This is for, this will be posted on our website for those who really, really love this stuff. They can go back and look at those 6 years. But the takeaway from this is really when you start at the top, fund balance, and I did talk about the need for fund balance, you'll see that that is $750,000 roughly less than it was last year. The driving factor for that is that in the current year, we have a significant increase of unanticipated expenditures in our special services programs. I've talked with committee, and this has been reported out, I believe, at some points to the board throughout the year. It has not so much to do, as I said before, with the number of classified students as the nature and complexity and involvement of their specific services and placements. This is unusual, as you can see, but it is what it is, and that's the result. That's the reason for, if you will, this decrease, because normally we would not have expended those funds from our reserves, but we needed them this year in order to cover these unanticipated changes in the nature of services that had to be provided. The next item, there is Sports Foundation capital contribution for the Wellness Center. This is the last year for that because this is also the last year for our capital lease payment on that. So at 1920, it's kind of like saying, whoopee, we now own it, so to speak. It's like, paying off your car or paying off your mortgage. That'll be done. Their contribution for that will end as well. The maintenance reserve number is down slightly year over year by about $116,000 we reserve, but normally we withdraw that amount, and then you'll see at the end of the year and next month we'll be refunding reserves. We tend to put it back because we generally have it there as a budget balancer in case other things don't come through during the course of the year, other miscellaneous receipts, but we feel that to balance the budget for next year we need less, so we're down about $116,000. The other thing I'd like to bring to your attention is the tuition and miscellaneous revenue. You'll see that's down about $250,000. That's also directly related to what's going on in our special services programs. Traditionally, the bulk of that money that you see there, about $1.2 million of it was coming from tuition that we receive from other public school districts in Somerset County who would send students to our special services self-contained classes where we had vacant seats. But because the mix of students we have is such that we have more students in those seats, we have less to offer to outside districts, and our enrollment in that sense is down from these other districts, as well as the corollary reduction that we see here in the revenue that we receive from them. In terms of state aid, you'll notice that it says $904,000, and you're going to say to me, well, a few slides ago you said it was $470,000. What I want to remind you of is that when I began this presentation, I said that we're doing budget-to-budget comparisons. So when we did the budget for the current year, 18-19, we did it and we approved it at the beginning of May. The state legislature did not approve what its appropriation was going to be until June 30th of midnight, so almost 2 months later. And at that point, they decided that they were going to give Berners Township and some other school districts around the state additional funds, which in our case amounted to $430,000. So that's why you see the dollar difference here, okay? Extraordinary aid, we normally budget that flat because we never know. Again, this is another one of those things that the state legislature does not tell us what they're going to give us for a given year. And in other words, they'll tell us what they're going to give us for this year, 18-19, when the year's over. June 30th, yes, I I see you're shaking your head, but that's the way they do it. They will be letting us know with they appropriate the funds for it on June 30th. So we'll actually get the money in August of next year. So obviously, not knowing from year to year, we've never known with certainty what they were going to do or how certain the state is of its resources. We've always budgeted it at what we believe is a conservative level. The fund balances has always sat there as a reserve for the kind of thing that I was talking to you about a few minutes ago, which are unanticipated costs and special services, which, as you can see, this year we needed. What else can I talk to you about here? Oh, the federal grant. So you see a $329,000 increase, and I alluded to that a few minutes ago, and I said that that was essentially an administrative anomaly. And by that, what I mean is that when we struck the budget last year, we were informed by the state of New Jersey in writing with a letter from their Title I grants office that we weren't going to be eligible for Title I funds this year. And then after the budget was struck, they said, oh, we made a mistake. So we have two letters on file, one of which says you're not going to get the funds, which is what we based the budget on last year, and the one which we got finally at the end of the year giving us the funds. So what you see here is the increase that's a result of those funds actually being received, even though we anticipated they were not going to be received. And then in terms of debt levy and debt service, you can see that they're relatively flat year over year. All right. So I already alluded to this. I won't go through it a whole lot, but it's there for those who want to look at it. This was essentially a recap of what state aid was expected to be based on the state's funding formula and what we actually received. As you can see, we've gone from negative to positive numbers, so to speak, but we're still down. It's going to take a while for the state to get us back what it took away. Taxes. I won't go through the whole thing. I think the takeaway is really kind of at the bottom. In the past 7 years, we've reduced our debt levy through refinancing of probably, I want to say somewhere off the top of my head, about 90% of the outstanding debt that we have. The next opportunity to refund debt will come up in 2022. The board's increased its bond rating to AAA. That puts us with less than a handful of districts that are K-12 around the state with that rating. And the anticipated tax impact, which is a 2% on the general levy, because of the slight reduction in the debt service levy, becomes 1.88%. And for Jake, this is just for you if you're here somewhere. I thought I saw him walk in. And Gene, you guys always, your editors always want to know how many cents on the assessed 100. Well, it's 2.126 cents per $100 of assessed value. If you want to know what that costs, every homeowner in the state of New Jersey gets a little green card, usually in January or February, from your tax assessor, and it says, this is what we assess the value of your property to be for the calendar year. Divide that number by 100, multiply it by 2 cents, and that'll tell you how much the school tax portion of your taxes increase are going to be. I can't account for I can't tell you what the township's portion of it's going to be or the county portion is going to be. This is a little bit more detail, but essentially the same slide on the very first slide. It just gives you a 5-year look at what general fund is, capital expense, federal, and debt service. This breaks out that general fund number in the preceding page, a little more than $96 million, between instructional and support costs. You can see general instruction is up 211, support's up $1.7 million. I'm going to give you the detail of that in a minute. Okay, so this will continue to drill down as we go forward. You see that general education is relatively flat year over year. Some people may have some concern or question about that, but what we have for those who are regular attendees of our meetings, you know that we've been talking for quite a while about the decrease generally in enrollment that the district has had. So for the upcoming year, we're looking at an expected enrollment of 5,107. That's down off of our high of about 5,700 plus. So even though our numbers have continued to go up or stay relatively static, that means that proportionately, we're still spending more per student when you do the math. Special education, as I alluded to earlier, had an increase in costs as a result of the nature and type of services for the students that it has, and as a result, we anticipate a corollary or a similar increase in the upcoming year based on the enrolled mix of students that are there, and that's why, excuse me, you do see, an $853,000 increase there. Basic skills and English as a second language are relatively flat. Extracurriculars, it looks like a large percentage, but it's only $38,000, and really that has to do with anticipated contractual increases and maybe some changes in hours for some of the things that we have in that mix, which include a lot of, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm fighting a cold here, hourly types of costs. So, based on the number of hours that are put in for things like intramurals or things that are put in for, team leaders or things like that, they're all thrown in there. Athletics, what we have there is an increase that's attributable to basically the bigger portion of it. About half of that is attributable to contractual increase and to longevity. So under the currently negotiated contract with the BTEA, individuals who are coaches for our various teams begin to get increasing amounts of longevity amounts, and they're not significant per individual, but you have to keep in mind when you really look at the list of the number of individuals and coaches, and some teams have multiple coaches given the sizes of the teams of longevity, it adds up. And so, that alone is probably worth about $30,000 out of that mix. Another $30,000 is probably contractual, and the rest is just basically, the mix of hours that we would anticipate for some things where people are working on an hourly basis in there. That takes us through athletics. We always provide this because there are one or two folks out there that want to know how much is being spent in my child's building. So, this breaks down basically what we have. When we say teachers, it's really teachers, nursing staff, instructional aides, if there are aides in there, although we generally don't, we segregate that out because we account for special services separately in our budget. And then anything else that's a purchase of service or supplies for that building. Here's a 5-year look at the special service programs in the district. These are the self-contained programs as well as the tuition that we spend for students that we have to send out of district. So what you can see here is that the ModCog program, and I have to go to my notes here, basically is really relatively flat. We're looking at contractual increases, the driver there, and also when you see a 3% increase of $37,000, that's often the case where out of our mix of 800 and plus full-time equivalent employees, we have employees coming back from leave. So if somebody comes back from leave, the salary cost for that line may go up a little bit, because normally when we hire a leave person, they're not at quite the exact salary of the person that they are replacing while that person is on leave. Thank you to Assistant Superintendent Syed for helping us with that efficiency. Learning and language disabilities, I would bring your attention to both that and to the behavioral disabilities line. You'll notice that one decreases by $80,000 and the other increases by $86,000, and that is a staff realignment between the two. Primarily that's in contractual increases. So what we have, and I've talked about this for probably the last 4 or 5 years, that there is a high degree of mobility that the supervisors of special services exercise in moving their staff between some of these programs as students are moved from one program to another sometimes during the course of a year. Depending on the timing of when that's done, you'll see these kinds of changes, because net overall for these programs, we have no reduction or increase in staff. But if you actually look at the bodies going from one to another, which becomes a rather detailed analysis, that's what you see going on. The other programs are relatively flat there. I want to bring to your attention the item down there for resource room. There's a significant increase there in terms of dollars, even though the percentage is relatively small. That's staff returning from leave, but also extended school year. As I alluded to a few minutes ago, the extended school year programs have increased significantly over the last 5 years and continue to trend up, so that's a significant portion of that increase. In terms of tuition costs, which you see down there as a 31% increase plus, $600 and some thousand, that has to do really with two things when you're comparing it back to the budget. It has to do with the nature of placements, and it has to do with the timing. So, sometimes prior to the IEP cycle, which normally begins in the late spring, it's usually after we've struck the budget the first time, you'll see changes. But in this case, you also sometimes see during the course of the year the need driven by a student's need to have a sooner change in placement, or a student that may be in a district class placed out of district because their needs have accelerated at a rate faster than was anticipated, and or could be provided by whatever placement they were in, be that here in the district or out of the district. But that's really what's driving that, because overall the number of students that we place out of district is relatively static year over year. It's in that 38 to 40 range. We're still relatively in that range, but we're seeing some more students with more intensive needs, as I've said before, and so that's kind of what we're seeing here. This is a breakdown of support services. So beginning with health services, I mean, they're relatively, you'll see that the dollar amounts are relatively flat or static. Those, again, when you see that, are a lot of times because while there are still contractual increases, we may have people on leave. And so when people go on leave, what I do when I build the budget is in February, we'll say, well, who are the known people that are going to be on leave throughout that year? And we will adjust for what that is. We will put in what we anticipate the leave replacement cost is going to be, so that'll bring down the cost. But that's kind of the ebb and the flow of the way a budget works for us in terms of balancing it from year to year. It gives us a little more room in other places, so we don't always just budget at what the incumbent salary is going to be. We're going to budget at what the actual occupant of that position is going to be, and in some cases that's a hybrid number. It's a blend of both the incumbent salary and the leave replacement salary. In terms of the related services and also extraordinary services, these are increases that are driven by the number of classified students in the self-contained classes. I've already kind of alluded to that factor as a driver in our budget right now. In terms of what's going on with guidance, really this alludes to what I was talking about with Title I. So last year, when we were told by the state in writing that we were not going to receive Title I funds, we went to the supervisor who handles that program in the district and said, what's the basic amount that you need to kind of sustain it for a year? And not necessarily grow it, but sustain it, and that number was about $100,000 if I remember correctly. And so because a lot of what's involved with that is K-2 testing to see what children may have in terms of a potential learning or reading and speech issues, we budgeted that money in guidance because that's where we budget a lot of district-wide type of testing. Obviously, we don't need that because, as I just said a few slides back, we anticipate, now this year we're getting Title I funds. So as a result, we pull that money out of there and you see that reduction. Why is it not down $100,000? Because we have other offsetting increases, obviously, in there. That would be contractual increases or some supplies or some other renewals of cyclical software that they use for testing or for guidance or for assisting students with college placements. because there's a litany of those, and they're on cycles where sometimes we have to renew licenses on a cycle, and others where we renew it only on every year. Let me talk a little bit about central services, where you do see an increase there. A significant chunk of that are BTAA increases with staff that were coming on guide, so you do have staff there that when normally new administrators are hired, they are off guide for the first 3 years. Once they go on guide, they bump up significantly, obviously. So I won't get into all of the details of the negotiated contract that's out there. It's posted, if I remember correctly, and they can see it there if you like. But you normally, when that happens, you're going to see a big bump, bigger than normally the contractual increase. There's additional money in there for purchased services, and the balance is spread over some 40 other accounts, so I won't get down into the details on it, but the big driver really is the first two items that I mentioned to you. Operations and plant maintenance, that's a relatively small percentage, but the dollar number is relatively significant, so I'm going to mention it here. Additional district-wide and high school security staffing. So, we did not have an SLE03 at Ridge High School in the budget for this year. Yes, that person is out there right now, but remember I said up front, I'm comparing it with the budget that we struck to the budget that we're now striking. So that's one, and we have the monitor as well, and we do now also, and did not at that time, have a district-wide director of security. So those are your drivers there. FICA and PERS, 1.5%, significant money, but really as salaries go up, those percentages are going to go up because they bear a direct relationship to the first $138,000 of any employee's salary. So that means that that's the majority of our staff. So, if the salary goes up 1%, you're going to be paying 6.75% more on 1% of that salary increase. All right. Busing, I'd like to talk about that a little bit because it's a major component in our budget. We are looking at a relatively static number of students that we transport in district. So what you'll see here are first in the top tier there are in-district students that ride on the Gen Ed buses. So those are the large, 54 passenger buses that we have. Based on the current roster of riders that we have, which includes some 300 subscription riders, we anticipate about 2,500, still relatively static number of riders. We're looking at a relatively static cost for that from the Somerset County Ed Service Commission, and the cost per seat is $1,177 per seat. That's what it costs us for those seats. We have 152 students or so right now that are in district that are transported separately and have additional needs, and so therefore a lot of their buses have some sort of aide that rides on the bus to assist with those students, and the number of students on those buses is significantly less. They probably average somewhere around 7 or 8 riders to a bus, and they are significantly shorter in ride time for a number of reasons. That is another $1,074,000, and the cost per seat there is about $7,000. And then we have those students that are out of district. Now, you may have heard me say earlier, I said there are 38 to 40 students we have out of district, but some of these students are transported by their parents. And that's why we anticipate or average about 34 as being transported by the district. And that's at a cost of about $800,000. So significantly higher, but now these students are being transported significantly further. Some of these placements are outside of Somerset County, and therefore they also have usually an aide on those buses. Not all of them, but many of them do, and they have to travel further to do it. Those services are also, all of those services that you see here are provided through the Somerset County Ed Service Commission, which acts as our transportation department, and we have a contract with them specifically for that we annually renew and that we monitor annually. And they've done a great job for us, and in terms of the out-of-district transportation, they actually handle the procurement of third-party vendors. They don't provide that busing. They don't have that in their fleet to do. And because it's more cost-effective also for them to do it. And because as a public school entity, which they are by organic statute, their operating costs are going to be generally higher than a third party is going to be for that type of thing. So in summary, that's our proposed transportation budget. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our superintendent, Mr. Markarian.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McLaughlin. So we thought it'd be nice to just highlight a few things with respect to how the financials that Mr. McLaughlin just went over do in fact support district goals. We wanted to make a point this year to point out something that you might consider obvious, but nonetheless very important. It was something that came up in reviewing this year in our CUSAC review, that we could do a little bit more to point out how the district budget does in fact relate to the district goals. So the first district goal that we have actually this year and next year, because we often will have multi-year goals, the first one was to improve the district's overall capacity to ensure safety and security. So you might have heard Mr. McLaughlin talking about some increases in the budget that were new this year, and therefore carry into an increase into next year's budget, because as he described, we are always budgeting in the winter and spring for the following school year, and anything that happens late in the game doesn't necessarily get into the budget until the next cycle. So we see some increases for the Director of School Safety and Security, the SLEO Class 3 officer that hopefully you've noticed sitting in the security booth that was constructed recently this school year at the entrance of Ridge High School. Again, Mr. McLaughlin mentioned the campus monitor that we have supported by this budget. Going forward, we're looking to expand the security camera systems that we installed last summer, and there are funds designated to do so in next year's budget as well. We also have the opportunity to pursue a couple of different grants. One just came to us last week. We've started to get the process going on that one, and annually Mr. McLaughlin also pursues a safety grant associated with our insurance carrier. So we have some opportunities to try to support the financing of some other items through those grants. I noted effective school solutions here. In terms of improving the district's overall capacity to ensure safety and security, because they are in fact providing support services at our school district, in particular at Ridge High School, in the form of some social workers that are helping our students, but they're also helping our counseling team because they're taking some of the load off of them so they have more time to work with students in general, and I think that that helps our overall safety. They, of course, their services can support some of our other district goals, but I did mention them here. But you'll see that their services do apply in other areas. So our second district goal is about strengthening the ability of the staff to promote social, emotional health, and well-being outcomes through staff development. So when we say promote outcomes, we're talking about outcomes for all, outcomes for themselves, outcomes for the students, even parents, helping to support positive outcomes in working with parents. So this goal is largely about professional development. Our budget maintains, as Mr. McLaughlin pointed out, it maintains services. It maintains the budget lines that we have had in the past. Sorry. And conference registration and travel is included in our budget. We also have a budget for Staff College, where we set aside funds for the payment of our staff to run professional development courses for their colleagues. Many of the courses in our Staff College bulletin are designed to help our staff in this area. That should actually say Title II grant. We have access to federal funds for professional development in our Title II grant. We are going to be using some of those funds this year to help pay for instructional coaches, which can help with the professionalism of our staff in this area as well. Naturally, we have a contractual agreement with not only our administrative unit, but also with our teachers unit, and that contractual agreement contains resources designed to fund higher education for our staff in the form of tuition reimbursement. So we do maintain all of these resources in our budget to have ways to provide professional development for our staff. Our third district goal this year and next was to complete a strategic planning process. So we recently reported out on our strategic plan that we just finished, and one of the things we went over were the different strands or the different themes within that strategic plan. So I reminded everyone what those different strands were here on this slide. And as part of that, I wanted to let you know that doing a strategic plan, of course, has cost associated with it, but in a lot of ways, as we went through the strategic planning process, we saw how many of the agenda items tied back to some of the other district goals, which is kind of nice because we're already funding those. So when we talk about developing student competencies and budgeting, a lot of what we worked on in developing student competencies was associated with how we're educating the students and the programs that we're offering the students. So fortunately, every year we do set aside funds for curriculum writing, and we have set aside funds again for curriculum writing that will help support the development of curriculum to support strand one of developing student competencies. So we make that connection here. When we talk about developing staff competencies and empowerment, that in large part goes back to District Goal 2, where we're talking about professional development of our staff. So we do have resources to spend in order to try to accomplish each of the strands within the strategic planning process. Our support staff, our counselors, many of our staff members, our administrators, our instructional coaches, they're all going to be helping us with strand number 2 when we're talking about developing our staff and educating our staff. In strand 3, safety and security, that goes back to the very first goal that we were talking about, which was to focus on security in the district. Technology is very helpful with strand 4. Of course, we maintain a technology staff. We have a director of technology who's been instrumental in talking about how we can help enhance communication and collaboration. So one of the things that we're working on for next year that we rolled out soon this spring to parents and students really is changing student information systems. Now, if you've been coming to these board meetings for any length of time, that's not going to sound new to you because we recently switched student information systems when we went from a provider that we had a couple years ago to Aspen that we have now. And unfortunately, much to my chagrin, things did not go as well as I would have liked, and we are switching student information systems again. We feel better about where we are with this next go-around, and it does have, of course, it's a software, it's a technology that we're going to be using, and we're hoping that it's going to be better than anything that we've had so far, but time will tell. I know I sound like a broken record if you were listening to me 2 years ago on this subject, but we're taking another swing at this, and we do actually feel better already with the experience that we've had, so I'm hopeful. All right, staffing considerations. Okay, so we have an allocation of funds in the budget that's associated with staffing. We make the best use of those funds, and we minimize the growth in those funds to the areas that we really don't have a lot of choice about. However, we're able to sometimes do some things a little bit differently as we have changes. And of late, as you are probably aware, we have had some declining enrollment, and Mr. McLaughlin reported out on that just a few minutes ago. So that gives you some opportunities to maybe take advantage of staff that were being used in one place and take that equivalent resource and apply it elsewhere. We've done this in recent past in terms of turning over, if you will, some of our elementary staffing positions that have declined because of enrollment changes and using them to hire staff to do enrichment instruction at the elementary school. So sometimes folks sort of get repurposed or positions get repurposed. So that sometimes can happen also through attrition. As staff members retire, it gives you opportunities to maybe change things up, but still use the same pool of resources, which are your staffing dollars. Student enrollment changes, as I mentioned, also play a factor in this. Student requests in the scheduling process also play a big factor in this. You need to try to staff things in a way that meets students' needs and requests. And sometimes those needs and requests are not optional. They're not related to elective courses, but they're in fact related to legal documents. And that's what I mean when I refer to individual education plans, or IEPs, right? Those are legal agreements that are worked out with the parents and the school district as to what services individual students are going to have. And so you have to meet those needs, and that can affect your staffing. Other data-driven needs can be things associated with data that we see with regard to safety and security or attendance, or data that we see with regard to testing outcomes. Many areas fall into that bucket. So what are some of the things that we are repurposing? We are going to do some repurposing relative largely to changes in elementary enrollments, where we have some flexibility to do some different things for next year. We are going to bring back the instructional coaching program. That program is really designed to help us accomplish one of our not only district goals, but also initiatives from our strategic plan. We're going to structure that in a way where one person is dedicated K-5 and a second at the 6-12 level. We're also going to work on Spanish. Now, specifically, I'm listing here 2 Spanish teachers. The reason that I'm not saying specifically where they're located is because the way that we're going to use the Spanish teachers is that they'll be working in more than one school for the purpose of being able to provide Spanish instruction at the elementary school. Growth positions, okay? Growth positions in this case, as I mentioned, are largely driven by requirements, okay? As I noted earlier when I was talking about including information about the district goals, we did have a CUSAC review this year, essentially a state monitoring review, and there were some areas that they asked us to work on. Really, they were somewhat out of compliance, and they said, hey, you guys need a plan to get up to speed on some things that have changed a little bit over time. And one of the things that they noted that had been changed is what you're allowed to provide for world language instruction at the elementary school. So you have to provide certified world language teachers even at the elementary school. So as you noted on the earlier slide, that was a big driver in us saying, hey, you know, we have the opportunity to do something different with our elementary staff. We see some enrollment declines. We anticipate some changes. We can use those resources to bring Spanish into the elementary schools, and we really need to. We had it in the past. We went away from it for budget reasons. Now we have the opportunity to bring it back, and not only do we have the opportunity to bring it back, but we also have identified it as a need out of compliance as well. So it's something that we want to do, it's something that we should do, and it's something that we're supposed to do since they changed the requirement of what is necessary for world language instruction at the elementary level. So for all the right reasons, as I noted on the prior slide, we want to get 2 Spanish teachers for that purpose. American Sign Language, that's a program that we started recently, and as I noted, in order to meet student requests for a growing program, sometimes you have to make staffing adjustments. English as a second language, again, this is a growing area in our district. We're required by law to be able to have the staff to meet the needs of these students whose first language is not English. And as we see the demographic changing a little bit in our district, we're really required to provide these services for our students, as well we should, because it is an obvious need for them. The last two items, again, go back to our CUSAC review, where we learned that we really need to be able to have at least an elective offering for students in both theater and dance at the middle school level. This is going to be a little bit of a challenge from the perspective of getting a staff member to do dance. We're hopeful that we have some positive leads, but trying to provide something that we're required to provide can be a challenge if you can't get the staff person to do the job. But we are budgeting to do so. We are looking to get a certified dance teacher for the middle school to at least offer elective opportunities for the students. Theater shouldn't be quite as challenging. We have a plan to do that, and that would require a 0.4 FTE, which means 2/5, or if you think about a secondary teacher schedule, somebody that teaches in grades 6 to 12, they teach 5 classes a day. So a 5/5 teacher is 1 full-time equivalent. Each class that they teach represents 1/5 of their 5/5. So 2/5 or 2 classes, 2 over 5 is 0.4. That's what we mean by 0.4 FTE. It basically represents 2/5 of someone's teaching schedule at the 6-12 level. And that's the plan. Okay? Yes, if you have questions?
So Rob, when you're talking about, I'm looking at the 6-year budget snapshot, the fund balance, so we spent $757,000, right? Because, and that was for special services, the one time. And then because of the tuition, we lost $250,000. So that's like about $1 million difference in our special ed. Would that be correct, kind of? Like, so we're $1 million, not in the hole, but we had to make up for the special needs program. And then when you go to the 5-year breakdown of instruction, so the special education went up, what, almost 6% this year. For next year, I get confused between the 2 years. It's going to go up 6%. You anticipate 6% every year? Like, was that like a one-time hit because of certain things? Or you can't?
I can't answer that question for you. Maybe, is Jean coming? Is she going to talk about that?
Yeah, so, I mean, we talk about this issue in general, right? The meeting students' needs in any area. It can vary and fluctuate from year to year. When I talk about this issue with superintendents and in other school districts, it is a challenge to meet some of the special education students' needs, and we do see costs that escalate beyond 2%. That is a reality. I think it's a reality that we see around the state. And part of the reason is not just a factor of things going on in new needs that students might have that can have high costs, but even maintaining existing programs. Rod and I both, having been business administrators, we see what happens with some of our out-of-district placements and the way tuition costs go up. They're not regulated in the same way that we are as public school districts, and therefore you can see increases 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% in tuition costs from year to year to year. So when you're at a 2% cap and you have those kinds of increases, that's completely out of your hands. It's nobody's fault. It just happens, and sometimes a student's program could be exactly the same from one year to the next, and it goes up by 5% in tuition. So it is.
I get it.
Yeah, it is a
I'm
challenge.
wondering if now we have to like pre-budget some kind of increase, because if it just pops up on us every year, it's a big
Well, that's
increase.
why we have the contingency of the extraordinary aid. Because if we were to budget for it, think about that. If I built in that amount every year and our tax levy only goes up $1.7 million and salaries are $1.5 million, the flexibility that I can find with the ebb and flow and the several hundred other accounts that I have is going to be rapidly absorbed by that alone. And that means that all of these other things that we're moving forward with initiatives, we don't give ourselves the flexibility to do that. Whereas right now, what we do,
It's a lot.
It
And
is.
it's not saying we don't have, I mean, it's a need, right?
Yeah. Well, we
But-
didn't experience the same thing last year.
Right.
So is it something
This is the
that's
first
gonna
time we've
happen?
had this kind of a scenario. I'm hoping we don't have it, but in all fairness,
And that's what,
still, we
that's
have
what
to
go-
say that
less students.
we-
This is with less students.
there are some times we do have students that have significantly higher needs than we've ever seen before. So it only takes one,
And also, I
right,
guess,
or two,
students' needs could change
that
from
have
year to year as
significantly
well.
higher needs. And, that's not necessarily known. I mean, a student could be here for 8 years and all of a sudden,
Right.
they need significantly more. No one knows why that is. We just know that, with all of the due diligence that's done by special services in terms of monitoring these children and working with them and the service, and evaluations and things that are done over and over throughout the year, if we knew the answer to that, we'd all be able to make a lot of people a lot happier, and probably including the parents and the kids, if we could
Right.
solve that mystery. We just don't know what
And
drives
and
it
also,
sometimes.
it doesn't talk about kids moving into town that aren't even here yet.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. That, I mean, and we've had that happen, and that
Right.
varies, right? That's another variable. So, our budgeting can be predictable and unpredictable at the same time, just like state aid can be predictable and unpredictable at the same time. Some areas can vary quite a bit, and we've had years where, like the last couple of years, we didn't see something like this during the course of the year, where we saw sudden needs come up that were expensive, and other years, like this year, we saw it. We've had years where we've seen a lot of movement into the district as students come in at pre-K ages, and that has caused us sometimes the need to open up a new class or a new section late in the summer, and other years where that hasn't happened. So it can be unpredictable, just like sometimes kindergarten enrollment can be unpredictable. You think you're okay, and then you realize that, late in the game, wow, we're gonna be forced to have to open another section, and that's just the reality of what we do. But I think that we take a conservative approach, and we've maintained the same approach since the time that I was BA through all the years that Rod has been the BA. We have a place in the budget that gives us some flexibility, and in years where the needs aren't as great, maybe at the end of the year, we're in a positive place. We have a little bit of quote-unquote extra. Years when we don't, it swings.
I just
the other
don't see
way.
that happening. That's just my,
Well,
like,
but we
I
have
don't
seen
see it get,
happen. We have seen
I
it
mean,
happen both ways.
it just seems like it's just gonna,
I don't know that we could necessarily say that that's going to be the case. I
No,
mean,
all
I
right.
think that the takeaway has to be that we do have this conservative approach to budgeting when we talk about extraordinary aid, because we know that the state doesn't
Okay.
give us that until the end of the year. But I will say that we have consistently gotten a significant amount above that once we've done the accounting. Now, the other part of that process, and I'm just going to go down that road a little bit for a minute to explain it a little bit more fully, we have to apply every year to the state for extraordinary aid. That process actually doesn't begin. Every year they've opened it up later and later, and this year they just opened it up at the end of last week. It used to be opened up in March. Now we're doing it in May, and they won't make a decision about that and what our eligible costs are until June. The good news is that means that sometimes in the past, you gave them a snapshot in time of the kids that were eligible. So if kids became eligible for some significant service in April and May in the past, they weren't captured in that. And so that's the good news, trying to look at the glass half full. The bad news is that we can never say with certainty, although I know there are moves afoot, including by Senator Sweeney, to kind of fully fund extraordinary aid, because they've never fully funded it. But we do get more than what we budget for. We build a conservative budget. That money has always been held, once we get it in August, as a reserve for this kind of contingency during the course of the year, which is why we didn't come to the board or the public during the course of the year and say, oh, we have to make some dramatic cuts in other operations in order to account for that. And so to the extent that, we're still doing that, we have that flexibility. I think the only thing we have to be aware of is, and it's very hard to pin it down, is what's going on with, do we have, a very small subset of students within that population that may begin to need more services, and why are they different all of a sudden? We have, where we usually had one really high-level student, we have two now, I think. Is
that's
that a
not all that
trend?
cost.
Is that a trend? I don't know that I could say that it is. You know, it's just that it only, you know, when they're, you know, high-need students, sometimes it takes, you know, it's going to be something that's going to actually show up on the radar, you know. Normally, you know, if a student needs an aid or something, yes, that's a significant amount of money, but it's not enough that you're going to notice it like this.
And I'm not questioning how you're budgeting or anything, I think it's.
No, I'm trying to give you
guys-
some assurance
I'm-
that there is some flexibility
I'm just worried that it's something
and
that we have to keep in
security.
our minds, that if things have to grow, you know, if you need more services, and it's, you know, it's like a real thing, like something we have to keep on top of. Thank you. And then I just was asking about, you know, because we had all that those bus issues. And I noticed that the percentage of bus seats used went like up, I think in the last like 5 years, went up 10%. And that's because we consolidated them?
We consolidated routes, yeah.
Which is
Because
great.
traditionally, we had gotten down to ridership that was somewhere in the high 50s on average in the 54-passenger buses. And with what we spend per bus, it's not effective or efficient.
Great. Thank you.
We good?
I just have one question about the last slide, and I apologize because I think I should know the answer. With regard to the CUSAC-driven positions for dance and theater, and Ms. Fox just shared with us offline here that there will be a cycle class for, I guess, one of those. I was just wondering, if there isn't student interest in the elective classes, what happens in that situation?
Well, our understanding was that we had to offer the classes, right? We had to offer the classes. If nobody signs up for the class, we can demonstrate that we offered the class. So I wouldn't think we would necessarily have to have the teaching staff in place if no one elected the class. You know, in the case of the dance, as I said, we're talking about elective courses for 8th grade. I think it was 6th grade cycle, Kristen, or 7th grade cycle for the dance?
7th grade cycles replacing math.
Right, the dance, right. So that's, right, so that would account for 3/5 of a teacher, right? So for dance, in a cycle class, you run that cycle class 3 periods a day. So that's 3/5. The other 2/5 would be associated with 8th grade electives. So it could, we have to see how that plays out, right? But we're budgeting. Remember, hiring
I
is
understand
a
that.
little later.
Yes.
Hopefully it all plays out, but it's in the budget to be able to hire it if the need is there. But to your question, I can follow up on that. You know,
I was
certainly.
just thinking, because of the difficulty that you
Right.
anticipate with securing individuals with these certifications,
Right.
that would be rather unfortunate if it was kind of a
Yeah.
forced, you were forced, you know, to
Right.
have the staff because of the
Yeah,
CUSAC.
I think we have some candidates in the pool.
Oh, okay.
But, you know, I mean, we've heard that before with difficult to fill positions. And sometimes people might imply that they're coming to us and in August they're somewhere else. So, you know, we are budgeting to try to do the right thing by the state review that we had. And if it doesn't go well, we'll certainly work with the county superintendent to keep him up to speed on how we are trying to meet the requirements.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Ryan.
Okay, so there's actually four parts of the public hearing on the budget. So we did the board forum on the budget. Now there's public comment on the budget. So if anyone in the audience has a public comment just on the topic of the budget, there's still going to be the other public comment opportunities later. If anyone has a comment on the budget, now is the time. Okay, then I will close that. So I'll close the public hearing on the budget. And that's done now, right? We don't vote on that now, right? Okay, so we're up to superintendent's report. There are two items. Would someone like to make a motion? Ms. White and Ms. Korn. Did you have anything to say before we vote?
I have one thing after the budget.
Okay, so let's vote on these two items. Does anyone have any questions about the items before we vote? Okay, could we have a roll call, please? Oh, someone, that's fine. Nobody made a motion yet? Okay, sorry. Oh, okay, so it was Jen and Jen, the two Jens, yeah, sorry.
Mr. Byrne?
Yes.
Ms. Schaefer?
Yes.
Mrs. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Salmon?
Yes.
Mrs. White?
Yes.
Mrs. Richmond?
Yes.
Mrs. Korn?
Yes.
Mrs. Wooldridge?
Yes.
Mrs. McCune?
Yes,
Madam President?
thank you. Okay, so now,
So just kind of related to our district goal initiative and something that is also going to be related to our strategic plan, one of the things we've been trying to do is broaden our presence on social media. So I just wanted to give the board a brief update on that. We are using a software called Hootsuite, which allows users to essentially write a message with some type of visual photograph clip to go along with the message. And when you use Hootsuite to post, it automatically posts to websites or social media sites that you have set up for the district. So we are roughly 2/3 of the way through getting each of our schools and our district set up. The web pages, you'll see if you go to different school web pages and the district web page, that now in addition to being able to select Twitter, you can also select Instagram and Facebook. You can enroll. And so there's three options, and the goal eventually would be to have all three of those available for not only individual schools, but also the Board of Education or the board office, if you will. So that'll be essentially 7 entities, each of which has 3 ways to follow. And when we post messages using Hootsuite, each of the schools, when they use the software, will be posting to all 3. So essentially, if you were to be signed up for all 3 at a given school, then each time a message goes out, it would go to 3 different feeds, if you will, depending on what you're signed up for. And so if you have a child at an elementary school, a middle school, the high school, and you also sign up for the board office, ultimately you would have 12 different social media feed possibilities. So we're getting there. And I wanted to just give you a quick update.
thank you. Does anyone have any questions about that?
When it's 100% online and ready to go, I will put something official out. But since it's still under construction, I'm kind of letting word of mouth take over for now. But we're close, and when it's finished, I'll put a note out to everybody. The other thing related to the district is the initial entrance at Ridge High School. We did purchase a lobby guard system, which is almost ready to go online. Mr. Kraus crafted a letter that we're just working on a little bit more in terms of giving some parents some instructions about how the lobby guard system works. But essentially, it requires that you're screened a little bit more thoroughly when you come in if you want to enter the building, and it's going to print a more official ID instead of just a little badge that says visitor with your name on it. So we're going to probably pilot that for maybe a couple weeks this spring, just to see how it goes, and then, we'll make some decisions about going forward.
Did you have something? Okay.
About the Hootsuite, that's just for the administrators or the teachers?
Yeah, so
or
it's
whoever?
not for teachers.
Okay.
A teacher might provide content to a administrator, but it's an administrative decision as to what gets posted.
So people can't respond, it's just
We
coming from
haven't
the
set it up to
school
be
the-
right. It's one way to the greatest extent possible. Settings on different social media platforms are not necessarily friendly to that
can do it.
philosophy. And things can be passed on and then commented on. But directly on the feed itself, we're minimizing that because the idea is to essentially share information. It's not a chat board scenario.
Not like a back and forth, it's just a push out kind of, okay.
What's it called?
The software is called Hootsuite.
Sweet.
Like,
Yeah,
like
like
an
an
owl. Yeah, and so they piloted at Cedar Hill, and people thought it had something to do with Cedar Hill's
Right.
mascot being an owl, but it just happens to be called Hootsuite.
It's just a coincidence.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
I tried it. It works.
It works, good.
Yeah, I sent out a picture with a little message a couple times.
Well, if you were able to do it, then
If
it's
I was able
probably
to do
very
it,
easy to use.
it reminds me of the Geico commercial. Even a caveman could do it.
Okay. Okay, now we're up to public comment on agenda items. If anyone has a comment on any of the agenda items, now is the time. No? Okay. We're up to approval of minutes. We have one item on there. Would someone like to make a motion for that? Mrs. Wooldridge and Mrs. Gray. Any comments or questions about the minutes? Okay, could we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Byrne,
Yes.
Ms. Schaefer,
Yes.
Mrs. Gray,
Yes.
Mr. Salmon,
Yes.
Mrs. White,
Yes.
Mrs. Richmond,
Yes.
Mrs. Korn,
Yes,
Mrs. Wooldridge,
Yes.
Mrs. McCune,
Yes.
Madam President.
Thank you. We're up to finance. There's 4 items. Would someone like to make a motion for the items? Mrs. Korn, Mrs. Wooldridge. Do you want to do your report and then we'll vote?
Sure. So Finance met on April 17th. The first discussion was a presentation by Tony Katana from Spiesel Architects addressing the expansion of the food service area and classroom space to address a unit lunch in a block scheduling. So given the analysis by Mr. Merenblum and some of the other discussions that have gone on related to the alternative scheduling, we know that additional classroom space will be needed as well as kitchen space to serve. So Tony, Mr. Katana presented an overview of Ridge High School with 4 options for locations for addressing this additional space. The first option is behind the PAC in part of the D parking lot. There's a small area, that's option 1. Option 2 was directly behind the 700 wing on the grass space there. And then 3 and 4 was opposite halves of the scrimmage field. So it was determined that option 2, the grass space behind the 700 wing would be the best option for several reasons. Number 1, it's a 2-story structure. It doesn't take up any parking or field space. It's adjacent existing parking lots for deliveries. May not need an additional stairwell because they can basically attach the new space to the existing space, which has a stairwell in it because it's a 2-story structure, and it accommodates kitchen, service space, and classroom needs, potentially 3 to 5 classrooms to implement block schedule and unit lunch. The construction timeline for option 2 would be essentially 2 summers. So if we put it out, for example, if we put out the project out to bid in the fall of this year coming up, construction could start in the spring of 2020 with the goal of getting the shell enclosed by the end of calendar year 2020, and then interior construction would continue into 2021, and occupancy would be in the fall of 2021. So that's just an example of the timeline, assuming that you went out to bid in the fall, but it is a 2-summer project, which Mr. Katana explained. Mr. Markarian provided an update on sectioning, general education, and special education classroom utilization, given that we could get potentially 3 to 5 extra classrooms out of this space. Unfortunately, there are no small group instruction in special services that utilize a small room, and they don't believe there's any way to consolidate small groups into a bigger classroom due to problems with overcrowding. Also, based on Ms. O'Connell's projections, the program for autistic students will require an additional room at Ridge High School next year and a further additional room in 2021. One option that was discussed was to find an alternative space either on or off campus for students that were 18 years or older that are learning life skills. Mr. Katana and Spiesel are going to draft a more detailed plan related to the option 2 expansion and come back and present that at one of the next Finance Committee meetings. An update as regards to the Aramark facilities staff was provided by Mr. McLaughlin. Aramark is still looking for a replacement to Steve Santoro, who's been gone for a month now. They are having problems finding this person, but we are continuing to inquire about that position. We did have a discussion about fee structures in on various topics for fiscal year 1920. So the first topic was facility use fees. Mr. McLaughlin proposed that the board increase the facility use fee structure 10% for each category. So the hourly rate for the use of the gym for in-town programs, for example, would increase $4 for the elementary schools and $6 for the high schools if those programs only meet 2 of the district's 3 exemption criteria. If a group meets all 3 exemption criteria, the cost remains $0, and the last rate increase for facility use fees was done in 2017. Mr. McLaughlin proposed that the board increase the fee for subscription busing by 10%. General education, as we saw in the presentation, general education busing costs the district approximately $1,177 per seat, but the fee for subscription busing that the board charges back to the parents is currently $767, so we would increase that by 10%. There was a discussion about before and after care fees. Before and after care is currently staffed by students, seniors from Ridge High School, aides, and teachers. This is a self-funding program separate and apart from the district's operating budget. If those staff members that are students, aides, and teachers would like to get an increase in pay, then that discussion is ongoing about how to implement that and the before and after care program. There was a discussion about the Title I federal grant amendment. Mr. McLaughlin explained that there are unexpended funds in the federal grant which must be used or they are forfeited. Ms. Vital is making a proposal for expenditures that will require the board to approve an amendment to the grant. The amendment will be proposed at the April or May meeting. I think we did that last week. On the agenda items, there's only 4 of them. The first one is disbursements, number 2 is professional development, number 3 is the budget, and number 4 is the municipal tax levy. Questions?
Thank you. We can have a roll call, please.
Mr. Byrne?
Yes.
Ms. Schaefer?
Yes.
Mrs. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Salmon?
Yes.
Mrs. White?
Yes.
Mrs. Richmond?
Yes.
Mrs. Korn?
Yes.
Mrs. Wooldridge?
Yes.
Mrs. McCune?
Yes.
Madam President?
Thank you. We're up to personnel. There are 10 items. Would someone like to make a motion? Mr. Salmon, and second, Mrs. Gray. I'll do committee reports. We actually have had 2 personnel meetings since the last time I reported out. So at the first one, which is on April 16th, or 18th, April 18th, we went over contracts for non-aligned staff, which includes several administrators, and then people that are not in the 2 unions, that are either central office staff, some of the IT staff, and people that aren't in either part of those unions. So we talked about those contracts. We talked about several different specific personnel situations. We then talked about a little bit about several stipends as pertains to our ongoing discussion for negotiations. We talked at both of the meetings about our negotiations with the BTEA. At the second meeting, we spent a lot of time coming up with another version of our proposal to give them. We have a session tomorrow with the BTEA, so we were preparing for that for most of that meeting. Let's see, is there anything else I can report out? Not a lot. It's a lot of negotiation stuff. Yeah, it was really just about specific personnel stuff and then the negotiations that we spent a lot of time going through in detail at the meeting in preparation for tomorrow. So, any questions? Okay, so we can have a roll call, please.
Mr. Byrne?
Yes.
Ms. Shaver?
Yes.
Mrs. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Salmon?
Yes.
Mrs. White?
Yes.
Mrs. Richmond?
Yes.
Mrs. Korn?
Yes.
Mrs. Wooldridge?
Yes.
Mrs. McCune?
Yes.
Madam President?
Thank you. We're up to the policy committee. You guys didn't meet since last time? Okay, they're meeting next week. Curriculum, it just met, right?
Curriculum met on Friday, and I'm working on the minutes. I'll have them out for next week.
Okay. Advocacy just met today, because I was there, so I know that. And so that will be next time. SEL?
I'm going to report out next week on that.
Okay. Liaison reports, Linda, you said you had one?
Yeah, I just have a very brief municipal alliance report. So there were just a couple things. This was from the April meeting. Caitlin Cartoccio reported that 502 Ridge students and 472 William Annan students completed the Pride survey in March. And she said the electronic permission slips were not as effective as they had hoped. So, and I know the survey results are in, but I think people are still working with them. The other item at the meeting was there was a very interesting presentation by Michael Calderon from Somerset County on a children's system of care, which is a statewide organization for children under age 21 and their families who need intervention because a child is experiencing a problem involving mental health, substance abuse, or behavioral, emotional, or developmental issues. All these services are free of charge and are billed through Medicaid, and the children get a temporary Medicaid number. So there were 4 sort of separate sub-organizations, and the interesting thing about this is I've lived in Berners Township for a long time, and I've been on the Municipal Alliance for over 5 years, and I hadn't heard about this organization before, and most of the other people hadn't either, so it was very interesting. And then the only other item was the peer educators, the new peer educators program at William Annan this year. The students have been working on the wellness unit, which is their 3rd unit for the year. And that was it.
Any questions for Linda? Sure.
With regard to the Pride survey, is that something that funds are connected to that is required to be presented at a public Board of Education meeting?
I believe it's going to be presented in the fall. Is that right, Nick? Okay.
And I'm sorry, but with 1 in 4 Ridge High School students represented in it, I'm not sure that it's going to tell us a whole lot about the population at Ridge High School on these question topics.
So we can talk to Caitlin and see if she can get some feedback on that question. In other words, how reasonable is it to draw any kind of conclusions?
Right.
You know, I mean, a sample size of 1,800 students where 500 respond is still not terrible, and actually it's less than that because it was only 10th and 12th grade,
It was
right?
2 grades.
So, right, so it's not,
Yeah.
right, it's only
Not
2
as bad as it
grades,
sounds.
right, so I was thinking the
6th
same
grade,
thing when you
8th
asked the
grade,
question. like, no,
10th and 12th.
10th and 12th, so 502 out of,
900 is not
so
terrible.
it's actually pretty good, it's more than half.
Yeah. And I believe this also is the first year that they've done the
Right,
Pride
it
survey,
was the
so
first
it'll
year.
be kind of a baseline,
Yes,
and hopefully they can get, a better participation next time.
yeah.
Okay, thank you, Linda. We're up to public comment on non-agenda items. If anyone has a public comment, please come up and tell us your name and address. No public comments? Okay, I'll close public comment. I don't remember a meeting where we had no public comments.
0 today.
We're up to board forum. Anyone have anything for board forum? No? Okay. Okay. Someone want to make a motion to adjourn? Mrs. White, Mrs. Wooldridge, second. All in favor? I remembered this time.